I'm Helen Bertelli. I'm co-founder of Women in Climate Tech, and I'm founder of Benecomms. I'm joined today by Jamie Alexander, Allie Thompson, and Jamesine Gibson in this webinar. In a moment, I'll invite each panelist to introduce themselves and their work. Then I'll briefly address the topic at hand. Then we'll get into the meat of the conversation and we'll take questions, as Kat said, in the chat function. So first and foremost, Jamie, welcome to the panel. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Jamie Alexander, and I'm with an organization called Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown really exists in order to analyze, assess, and communicate the biggest solutions to climate change. And I'm very happy to share that health and education for women and girls globally is a top climate solution. And so very, very happy to be here today supporting this important piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allie.
Hi, everybody. My name is Allie Thompson. I am a project lead at the Climate Service, where our product, Climanomics, quantifies climate risk in a financial metric. So I work specifically with our corporate and community customers, ranging from large global corporations to local nonprofit groups who represent our most vulnerable populations.
Thank you so much. And Jamesine.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm based in the Bay Area in California, where right now I have the distinct honor of working with the county that I live in, Alameda County, as a consultant and a senior climate analyst to help them develop their new climate action strategy, which is focused on reducing carbon emissions and increasing climate resilience in a way that helps center equity, and all within the context of current recovery efforts. And prior to that, have worked for more than 15 years on clean air and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies in both the public sector and nonprofit sector, and really focusing on the opportunities to meet those goals, but also maximize the health and community benefits and also address climate risk. So as you may imagine, women are an integral part of all of this work. So I'm really excited to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you so much. Such a great panel. We're really excited to have you all here. I have to just confess, I have a script. So I'll be looking sideways a little bit. It's always better to confess these things, right? So people don't think you're strange. I may be strange, but not too strange. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a spiel before we start. This is not traditionally, climate change is not traditionally, at least before I started Women in Climate Tech, I didn't really understand the issue and why it was so important, why gender was so important to the issue. So while we'll be talking today about the Women in Climate Change Act of 2021, it was introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Among other things, the act creates a working group in the Department of State to address gender-related issues related to climate change. So why are we discussing this? The act is most definitely a catalyst for an important conversation about the confluence and interrelatedness of gender and company and communities' ability to adapt successfully to climate change and meet, for example, net zero mandates. Our conversation today will focus on 3 pillars. The first is the reality that women are on the front lines. Women are most at risk when it comes to climate change. Already research suggests that about 80% of people displaced by climate impacts around the globe are women. Women and children are 14 times more likely to be killed by extreme weather events than men, for example. The second pillar of our discussion is that women are essential to reducing emissions. Jamie has some wonderful research that she'll be sharing with us on that, but investing in women and girls results in actual reduction of carbon emissions. So it's a very important pillar for us to be discussing. And then third, women are crucial to stability. Research shows elevating women counters violent extremism. And violent extremism, these things are projected to get worse as climate impacts worsen. Thus, this is a very important issue for national security. So assuming what I just mentioned is true, those 3 pillars that I just mentioned, what I'd like to challenge our listeners today to do is, our listeners, both the corporate listeners and those who are involved in public policy, is to think about how to elevate gender-related solutions in their climate risk work. What might this look like? And that's the question I want us to all think about. So when we think of climate tech, for example, many of us think of big machines that are sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. And while that certainly may be in our future, we all know that when and if that technology is possible, very likely it will not be enough. We need more measures for adaptation, and women are key to this. We need to think of climate tech more broadly and inclusively if we want the best possible outcomes. So another thought, there are many weighting schemes for estimating, for example, a country's adaptive capacity to climate change risk. What are the opportunities for weighting gender or investments in women as a critical piece of adaptation? And finally, how can diversity efforts inside of companies be quantified? How can they be married with corporate climate and net zero efforts so as to achieve better outcomes? So these are all really, really big questions. We're not gonna, give you all the answers today. We'll certainly give you a lot of food for thought, but the answers to these questions could really lead us, the world, towards better and more effective solutions to climate change, thus the need for the legislation, thus the need for the Women in Climate Change Act, and a push to shine a spotlight on this important part of climate change that's not often talked about in great depth. So I'd encourage our listeners to weigh in with thoughts during the chat, using the chat. We'll tackle questions and comments at the end, as Katrin said. Without further ado, we'll get started. I'd like to talk about pillar number 1. Jamesine, when we talked about this on Friday, you had some very interesting information on the fact that women are on the front lines of climate impacts. I'd love you to chat about that.
Sure. Well, as we know, climate change is a threat multiplier, and it exacerbates existing threats and inequalities, and people on the front lines are going to be affected first and worst, and that most definitely includes women. So I'm sure you're here today. There are a lot of reasons for that. I'll list just a few. One is that they have less decision-making power. They're not elevated into a lot of the processes that determine how our society operates, or how resources used or whatnot. They also work in a lot of climate sensitive work. 1 in 3 women globally works in agriculture, and we know that that is a very at-risk sector from climate change impacts. There's also limited and unequal access to resources, whether that's financial, information, technology, natural resources. And then there also are social and cultural or household expectations. And I'll spend just a moment talking about this one, because I think this is one that I've heard a bit less about, and Helen asked me to talk a bit more about. So women around the world are primarily responsible for providing goods for their households, whether that's water or energy or food. And we know that with climate change, droughts are going to become increasingly severe and frequent. And that means that for girls and women, predominantly in rural areas, they are basically going to take on even more of a, I guess, part-time job equivalent of getting fuels and water. And that means really long walks to get these that can impact their health, putting them at risk to violence. It also impacts girls' abilities to go to school and other productive activities of women. We know, so droughts are not the only climate impact. There's also flooding that's going to become increasingly severe and dangerous due to climate change. And this is another impact where social norms affect women's vulnerability. I have seen studies in regards to the 2007 tsunami in Bangladesh, where women died at much higher rates than men. And research has highlighted that that one of the factors for that was actually a cultural practice where, at least at the time, I don't know if it still exists, there was, it was considered normal not to teach young women and girls to swim as much as men. So they were just inherently very vulnerable from that perspective.
Thank you. I think discussing some of the reasons why women are more vulnerable really helps to paint the picture, because it's not something necessarily intuitively. For example, we live in the United States that we often think about, not being able to have access to swimming lessons, for example. Allie, I'd love for you to talk a bit about your experiences.
Sure. Similarly, at TCS, we're working with a few tribal groups in North Carolina, where we've pretty much seen traditionally that women are more responsible for the crop cultivation and food distribution within their communities. So with Climatenomics, what we're doing is we're creating a climate risk assessment where we'll be able to tell them what areas of their land hold the highest climate risk, which crops are the most vulnerable, and even what decadal timeframe will hold the most impact. And then we're able to then tell them what the financial impact is to their resources. So in some respects, women are on the front lines of defense in the climate fight. And in majority of the tribal communities we've seen so far, they hold the most responsibility for the well-being and survival of their communities.
I love that. And I think that's so important, because knowledge is power. And I think, Allie, that's a lot about the work that you do, is really uncovering the impacts that are to come and who will be impacted. And if you're able to give that knowledge to the women who are the gatekeepers in many ways of the food and whatnot, you will involve them in the decision making for the solutions, which will engender better solutions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Jamie, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think Allie and Jamesine really covered it. But the climate crisis is not gender neutral. We know that, as Jamesine said, it makes existing injustices and vulnerability worse, especially under conditions of poverty. And I saw that when I was working in maternal and child healthcare in Bangladesh in 2007 and 2008. That the burden was predominantly carried by women who are the caretakers, who are the community, often the fabric of the community, the informal and formal educators, who really, and when there's like strife in a community, if the women aren't able to patch all of it together, that has really, that has ripple effects. And so it really matters. And I think we at Project Drawdown then see the flip side of that, the opportunity there to close those gaps and look at what's possible when we address some of these inequities.
I'm going to ask you to keep talking about that, because we're going to talk now about pillar number 2, which is this emerging research, eye-opening research to suggest that investing in women, educating girls, has the literal effect of reducing carbon emissions. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So one of my former colleagues and good friend, Catherine Wilkinson, says, when you're close to the problem, you're necessarily close to the solutions. And so I think that really is the basis for what we're talking about. Our research at Project Drawdown shows that if we gain ground on gender equity, we also gain ground on addressing climate change. So according to our analysis at Project Drawdown, it primarily focuses around providing high quality healthcare and education for women and girls globally. Right now, hundreds of millions of girls are, denied their right to attend schools, especially secondary schools. And when we have more years of education, we tend to have better health outcomes, and we have more agency, both at home in our families and then in society. And that agency, enables us to have more autonomy around our decisions. And therefore, we often choose to marry later and we have fewer children. So our families end up being smaller. And I want to stress that like the value here is on the autonomy and the rights of women and girls, and that the reduction in carbon emissions because of that is a side effect, but the value here is on, you know, the autonomy and rights of women and girls. And so that, you know, reducing, you know, making decisions to, for your own family, you know, your own family decisions adds up over time and will end up in, you know, having implications for how many people live on this planet, and therefore the cascading demands on our food, electricity, our buildings, and all of the things that we do in life. So closing this gap, according to our analysis of Project Drawdown, closing this gap and, you know, providing equitable access to healthcare and education could result in up to 1 billion fewer people inhabiting Earth through 2050. And this is a result of women having autonomy to make their own decisions. And 1 billion fewer people is approximately, you know, could lead to 120 billion tons of emissions. And at that level of impact, you know, gender equity is like a top solution on par with wind turbines and solar panels.
That is so eye-opening and fascinating, and not something that you normally hear about. I want to talk for a second, Jamesine. When we talked on Friday, and I brought up, and this is a shout out to Audrey Scott, who was our speaker in January. She travels around and does amazing sustainability work, but she really told some stories on the ground work with clean cook stoves. She had been involved in a couple of projects, and that really to me brought home the connection between climate tech and women's rights. If you think of climate tech being potentially a clean cook stove, the impact that can have on families, because millions upon millions of families are reliant upon sort of dirty cook stoves that create pollution, both for both carbon for the climate change, for problematic for climate change, but also for children's health, etc. So Jamesine, you told me a little bit about your experience in that area, and I just think that helps to illustrate how important it is to empower women around the world, and how the collective impact might be.
Sure, and I think the clean cook stoves are yet another example of climate tech helping to not just reduce climate emissions and improve public health. We know that the particulate matter pollution emitted from these stoves is one of the major health threats to children worldwide. And also at the same time, because they're more efficient, women and girls spend less time going looking for fuel, which then frees up time for them to go to school, as Jamie mentioned, or to do other productive activities. And so I think it's really helpful to kind of take that holistic lens for these. And so many moons ago, when I was getting my master's, I did some research in Helen, Guatemala, specifically on the health impacts of cleaner cook stoves, looking at it over a long-term study for the National Institutes of Health. And I spent a lot of time with community members who they saw the negative impacts on their children, on themselves, on the elderly, and they were really interested in trying different cleaner cook stoves. However, these newer stoves weren't always being used in the most optimal way. So the way that they were designed, it wasn't necessarily getting the desired or achieved outcomes. And then as I got more involved in the community, found out about other places where communities had been had stoves distributed. They used them for a short period of time, and then they stopped using them. And so they were these great technology ideas, you know, that people came up with, and then they put them in the field, and they weren't necessarily designed to meet the user needs or the local contexts. And many of the users of these were indeed women. And so piggybacking on another great thing that Jamie mentioned was that women they're really close to the problems. And so they necessarily need to be part of designing the solutions so that they can actually be effective in achieving the desired outcomes on the ground. And they really need to be involved in design thinking. Fortunately, I did a little bit more digging because I haven't been involved in the field for a while, and it looks like the rates of adoption have gotten better through addressing user needs and several other challenges. And I think there are so many other climate mitigation and adaptation strategies where design thinking with women is huge, like climate smart ag or resilient water supplies or safe low carbon public transportation and ways that we address health impacts of climate change. So it's a critical piece of it.
I think that's a tremendous allegory for the involvement of women across the board in, focusing on this issue. And it brings me to the question that I asked earlier, which is how can companies that are looking to address these issues, looking to invest in innovation, how can they marry their diversity inclusion efforts in a way with their climate efforts in a way that gets them better, more impactful results? Allie, I don't know if you have any thoughts here. I know the Climate Service has a tremendous diversity and inclusion program.
Sure. So something we're working on at TCS, which stemmed from an internal educational series during Women's History Month, is that we learned that it was apparent that boys tend to go into more STEM careers more so than girls. And so in this presentation, I wanted to understand, why was this the case? And so I found a study that showed 83% of boys in high school opted for STEM subjects, while only 64% of girls opted for STEM subjects. And when I wanted to look into the reasons why this was the case, the study showed that many of the girls who opted for STEM, or they chose not to opt for STEM because they had never been told that they could have a career in STEM, or that it was never suggested as a career path for them. So the study shows that only 60% of the females who responded had been suggested STEM as a career path, where nearly 40% of the male respondents had been suggested a STEM, a career in STEM. So at TCS, what we want to do is we're working on a new initiative that not only educates, but empowers girls to pursue careers in climate tech. And so we're very early in the stages of this, but this will be an educational series where we visit schools in grade school and high school and some colleges to empower women to pursue careers in climate tech.
That's fantastic. And I just will tell my own personal story for a second. I have two daughters, one of whom is 14. A few years ago, she was super excited to join her school's robotics club. And I struggled because I did not have a background in STEM. I struggled with, how to help her, but she was the whole robotics club was about 15 kids in total, maybe a dozen or to 15, all boys except for Ava and one other little girl. And without going into detail, it was so difficult. There was a lot of different factors, but she ended up deciding she didn't want to do it anymore. And it wasn't for her. She just didn't have, all of these boys had robots and whatnot growing up. They were, I don't know, they had an edge, and it just struck me as such a shame. How can we restructure things? How can we show girls that they have a future in this? Because it goes back to, we need engineers, we need scientists, we need women. I sometimes say our moonshot at women in climate tech is at least 50% representation at every table on this issue. We can't have the same structures trying to tackle this problem that ended up, that are the reason why we got here. So I applaud that work. That's fantastic. I do want to transition to talking a little bit about national security. I just, as I was writing more about this, this topic, I realized, you know, the involvement of the State Department, and, you know, I think that's part of the genius of this act, is to seed interest and investment in this issue, and in advance of the impacts that are coming, in advance of we're already seeing destruction and impacts getting worse. This has the effect of destabilizing nations. And I'm sure this is on the radar of plenty of economists, of plenty of, you know, political scientists, etc. But nations that struggle with climate impacts can be destabilized. You can see violent extremism, and elevating women is one of the most effective ways of fighting that. So as I was writing about this act, what I had in my mind was, my goodness, what is the risk as climate impacts get worse? What is the risk that we backslip as a society? You know, we talked a little bit, Jamie, you talked about the role of educating women and how important it is to educate girls, and how that leads to carbon emission reductions. Well, what if the world moves towards more violent extremism? What if the world moves, you know, what if the impacts then have the knock-on effects of reducing girls' education, of, you know, increasing extremism? What if we backslip? Then we also lose pillar 1 and pillar 2, right? We lose the ability to empower women to reduce carbon emissions. So it's a double whammy. I feel like there's a very strong connection to national security here. And I just want to throw this open to you guys to ask if any of you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I can jump in with my, you know, kind of quick thoughts. I mean, yeah, as we kind of talked about earlier, like, women are often, in both in the United States and around the world, the backbone of society, and they're often the caretakers, and they provide just like a really you know, uniting kind of fabric. And so when women's voices are silenced, or when they're, you know, not at the table, entire communities suffer, and that suffering often is what leads to conflict. And so, you know, in many parts of the world, including places where I've worked, you know, doing maternal and child health work, improving peace and security means empowering women. And I think that's true in terms of peace building. And also, I think, as Allie and Jamesine said earlier, that women are often the primary farmers of the world, and that, you know, they produce 60 to 80% of food in lower income countries. And so when women have more capital and more access to training and technology to improve their farms, that can improve food security in, you know, in developing economies. And improved food security can mean more, you know, more stabilization, less political unrest, like less things to, you know, to cause tension, and, you know, and particularly when it's around something as central as food. And so I think those are two things that come to mind where, you know, where this issue is really important in terms of, you know, the political situation that hopefully we can avert.
Yep. Jamesine, you had talked a little bit about before, when we talked on Friday, about the might of the US government to direct funds and direct, you know, encourage investment and to promote dollars in women, and the way that the act might work to do just that. Would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. And I want to add, I found a really interesting quote, or I guess statistic, related to women in peacekeeping, and it said that if a peace agreement includes women, it's 35% more likely to last at least 15 years, which I thought was
wow.
pretty striking. Yeah, I thought that was so. just to underscore everything that everyone has said about the value of women, involving women and elevating them in peacekeeping efforts. So I have worked at the federal government and also worked in US Congress, where we were looking at federal government budgets. So in this conversation, because the legislation focuses on the federal government, we're talking about the monetary heft and might that if women were elevated in climate change actions and priorities across the government, what that could mean in terms of investments towards women. And one of those has to do with procurement, both here and abroad. Last year, the local government spent $500 billion on procurement. So can you imagine if that had a gender responsive lens? And that has to do with, you could do that through developing criteria for who it contracts with in terms of services and products, and do that in creative ways to help invest in women. There are also, you could think about the investments that have recently been made in terms of COVID recovery from the stimulus, which definitely has taken a lens to help to support women. And then also the infrastructure plan that was just released. There's a lot of financial capital there too. Also thinking about policies here and abroad, we've got foreign aid, which is tens of billions of dollars. And just looking really briefly this weekend, there's definitely a huge need for a more, just more dedicated financing for women's empowerment, particularly related to natural resources like water and energy and forestry management. And we also, I was thinking locally, are there things that we could look to? And part of President Biden's approach to climate action is to apply a lens where 40% of climate actions have to benefit disadvantaged communities. And women, of course, are a huge part of that. So that'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. And part of the bill involves agencies that will be implementing those policies and investments here locally. And then, of course, there are incentives to businesses and residents as well that can impact that. And I want to underscore that it's really important that this isn't just box ticking to show like another form of what people might call greenwashing, but that there actually is accountability and transparency for the government in doing this.
Allie, did you have a comment there? I saw you unmuted for a second.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of pivot a bit to go a little deeper on security for women and access to resources. So, you know, we know that people of color will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we've just learned that women will make up over 80% of those displaced by climate change. So I like to step back and think for a second, where does that put Black women and Indigenous women and women of color who will be placed in a particularly vulnerable position? And so last summer, there was a study that was released that stated higher temperatures and pollution were linked to premature and underweight births. And this was particularly evident in Black and Indigenous women. They were the most affected by this. Particularly in California, for every 10-degree increase in temperature, there was an increase of preterm deliveries by 8%. But for Black and Indigenous women, that rate was 15%, so nearly doubled. So it is absolutely critical to reduce emissions for women all over the world.
That is, that's so interesting. Thank you both so much for your perspectives. I wanted to acknowledge one of the attendees here, Jennifer Posner. She mentioned too, with regard to violence against women, research has shown a connection between aggression and increased extreme temperatures. In other words, this is not a problem that will be going away anytime soon. As we know, women in domestic violence situations often bear the brunt of the increased aggression. So I think that was a very, very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. I just want to open up the discussion here. I particularly doing a lot now in the climate space. I find it interesting, I grapple with, and I'm sure you guys do too. We have a lot of members who are large corporations, who are in the business sphere, and there does seem to be a continued reticence on the part of business to actively support legislation. And part of that is, that many are barred from doing so. They're not lobbying entities, but often you'll see corporate dollars going into, for example, supporting certain chambers of commerce that actively lobby against climate action and so on and so forth. So I think that, I guess my point is, I think it's very important to say publicly that if we're going to get to net zero, if companies are going to meet their net zero mandates, that is an issue they have to start grappling with in more depth, I believe. We cannot come to this solution individually. There has to be collective effort here. That's one of the reasons why I am so excited about the Women in Climate Change Act, how the broad questions that I asked at the beginning of this discussion, these are big questions. There are answers out there, but more research is needed, so much more research. It's such a nascent area. And if we can, in the way that we build solutions, if we can build gender into that so that we get better outcomes, why wouldn't we?
Yeah,
I feel like this is important legislation. Sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
I was just going to plus one, everything that you just said, and Allie, that you said, and Jameson. I think the corporate, and I think that the kind of the window of time in which companies have been able to sort of have these vague long-term targets where they're like, addressing climate change out of one side of their business, but then negatively impacting it through all the other channels like policy and lobbying and investments. I think that time is coming to a quick close now, thankfully, as more and more people are kind of like calling them on this contradictory approach. And I think that's inclusive of this issue that we're talking about today, is that the more that we see gender equity and, as a part of this huge challenge that we're trying to tackle, it's all one and the same. Then companies have to look at it all together. They have to, and they have to see it as integral to their business, not just out of one side of their, ESG or sustainability house, but like the entire, the entire way that businesses show up in the world has to be fully aligned with all of this. So I think the more we can make the case that these are, inextricably linked, the more case we'll have for businesses to engage with it, get off the sidelines.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of comments I wanted to acknowledge. First, one is from Mary Ruth. A new study has shown that climate change is driving an increase in child marriages in Bangladesh as men deal with job losses related to climate. They look to dowries as a form of income. So many ramifications. Someone here has also mentioned a study, a Georgetown study. What we'll do is we'll share a link to, I think everyone can see that link, but we'll also share that on our LinkedIn channel as a follow-up. There's so much good information here. I do feel like one of the takeaways for me personally is I would love to have another session where we do a very deep dive into how to bring together diversity and inclusion efforts and the net zero efforts, the climate teams, women in climate tech. We've done a survey of our members, and our members range from very small companies to very, very, very large companies, and everything in between. But still, we ask the question, what is the size of your climate team or equivalent? And still the vast majority of people, of companies, their climate teams are 1 to 5 people. And you can imagine in a multinational company, that's just not going to be enough. So clearly there's a lot of work ahead of us. Clearly we're not going to get it perfect or get it right at the start, but as we're building teams, as we're building solutions, I feel like this is such an important part of the conversation. It's so important. From all of the avenues. So one of the things that prompted me to start Women in Climate Tech was knowing, I think there was a KPMG study last year, suggesting that, there's billions upon billions pouring into climate tech now, and only about 10% of that money, at least at the time of the study, was going to women-owned businesses. So across the board, we're seeing, again, women being left out of the situation, of the discussion, of the solutions. And Jamesine, I just can't, clean cook stoves is obviously very, very different, but it's a very parallel argument. How can we possibly come to the table and build solutions if half the world's population is left out of those conversations? All right, I want to invite anybody else to come forward and talk about any ways that they might be, that in their businesses or in their organizations, how they might be marrying DEI efforts and climate. Someone's suggesting here, Christina Kowak is a strong voice in this area. Jamie, you're nodding. Do you know her work?
Yes, I know of her work, and this looks like a great resource for her writing. Yeah, and this is linked to one other point I wanted to make that I feel like we haven't specifically touched on, and maybe it's really obvious, but that like women are just tend to be better leaders when it comes to the environment, whether it's like inside companies or like, in state legislatures or in city government. Like they tend to like just support stricter environmental laws and be more collaborative and things, as Jamesine, I think you referenced, that treaties or peacemaking tends to be more, last longer when there are women involved. So it feels so like it's also a leadership issue that we need to work on. And we're not saying that this is only about women, but that like women need to be at the table at all of these levels.
I think that's such an important point. And also the research that shows, women, companies that have more women on, for example, in their C-suite or on their boards tend to do better. And that's incredibly interesting. And as we wrote, for example, the press release about our big, push on the act today, we put out a press release, and one of the comments that my colleague Emily has in there is that this research, so much research shows that involving women leads to better outcomes. Why would we not want to employ that strategy as we face the greatest problem the world has ever encountered? So I think that's a very, very powerful point, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jamie. We did get an interesting question in the Q&A. I think this is a fascinating question. I'd love to get you guys' take. What do we see as the lowest hanging fruit or the quickest ways to integrate women while working on longer term solutions? Jamesine, do you have any thoughts on that? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I mean, I think climate solutions are so place and context dependent, right? So the work that I am doing here at the local level, a lot of what we are trying to really do is to elevate the voices of people and communities that are not at the table, and voices that are experiencing climate impacts in the here and now, voices that are on the front lines of air pollution and water pollution and all the other harmful impacts associated with fossil fuels. And so I think, I don't want to say it's the lowest hanging fruit, but I will say that it's incredibly necessary, is as we're focusing on the large scale transformational changes we need in our society to get to net zero carbon and to be a lot more resilient to the climate impacts that we know are coming down the line, is to really focus on equitable community engagement and involving those voices in the solutions that we are putting forward at the local level, whether that is how to design a microgrid with storage battery power, because we know we're going to have more wildfires here in California, hopefully not this summer, but they're coming. And we have power outages to get rid of those, to at least minimize the risks associated with that. And so how do we have clean energy to support communities in that way? Or thinking about from the transportation side, what does that mean? We've got a lot of EV vehicles that we want to put forward, but how do we do that in a really equitable way so that we're addressing a lot of these issues? So I think part of it is the technology and the solution, but a big part of it is also the process that we go through to identify those and also effectively and equitably implement the solutions.
I wanted just to weigh in because I had a thought. I had a very, very interesting conversation with some colleagues this morning, all about, I believe, I haven't seen it. I believe there's a petition going around for companies to sign stating they will not appear on all male panels, or manels, they call it. I thought that was fascinating. You know, I don't know necessarily if advocating for that, but I do think it raises a very important point, and that is when we think about low-hanging fruit, we think about all of the things that we've gotten used to in our lives and our careers, and certainly for me, 20 plus years in marketing and public relations in the industry I was in prior to coming to climate. Vast majority of my clients, a vast majority of the people I was working with were men, white men, and that was the paradigm. It was just the norm, and I do think we have to find ways to try to break that apart. We try to elevate women's voices and leadership any way we can. So in that respect, the low-hanging fruit might be our everyday, rethinking our everyday operations as we go through our days. How do we change our individual behavior? How do we try to upend what we have been taught is normal? And maybe it's in just very, very small ways, but because those incremental changes, they add up across the board. And yeah, so that, I don't know, manels, I thought that was just so interesting. Yeah, I want to, before people jump off, I do want to address our two big sort of call to actions, takeaways here. And then feel free to, because we only have a few more minutes left, to add any more questions you might have. We have two main call to actions. The first is Women in Climate Tech. We are working with corporate partners on drafting a letter in support of the Women in Climate Change Act. And we would love to hear from you if you would like to support this. Just simply reach out to us on our website, it's womeninclimatetech.org. And we're looking to work with anybody and every company just to put their names on the letter and show support. Jamie, I know this is a type of work some you've been involved with in the past. But yeah, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know if you would like to work with us on that. And the second piece is we're doing for lack of a better way, we're doing a splash mob where we're all changing our LinkedIn splashes to just show the act and show our support of the act between now and Earth Day, just to shine a light on gender diversity and how important these issues are in the context of climate change. So we invite you to do the same, and you can find that on our LinkedIn or on our website as well. Those are the two main call to actions. I want to just open the floor to any final comments before we jump off.
Thank you so much, Helen, for having us. And I think the last thing I just want to say is in the arena of climate change and gender and diversity, we can't end the call without mentioning members of the LGBTQ community. Trans or non-binary also face tremendous vulnerabilities to climate change as well. And to save everything, we need everybody. Thank you all.
I think that's a really good point, and I've studied this a little bit in the past as well. That a lot of homeless youth tend to be LGBTQ, and of course, if you're homeless, you're certainly more vulnerable to climate impacts, extreme heat, especially. Jamie.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that really important reminder, Allie. And I also just wanted to add that I think none of what we're saying here is intended to give an additional sort of responsibility to women. Like, women are tired and doing a lot. Young kids who have been,
yes,
virtual schooling for a year now, and it's really hard. I think, so Helen, I really appreciate your point of look for what you can do where you are. We're not saying women have to jump in and make climate their new 86th thing that they're, having to do in their lives. But we have a lot of power. We deserve to be at the table, and we can look for where we can, we can contribute from where we are.
I think that's a great point, and it's one we didn't really go into great depth. Was COVID is a great example of how, it just cut many women off at the knees. So many women had to leave that workforce because they were the primary caregivers, and it's a corollary. You can see when something like this hits how, women tend to bear the brunt in many ways, and so there are some parallels there to climate change that are very important to consider.
And I think that as you both mentioned, just reiterates the importance of any actions that we take from a policy perspective to help move us forward towards recovery. They need to center women. They need to center frontline communities. And I think when we were talking earlier about how a lot of places have climate teams that are 1 or 3 people, my mind immediately went to thinking about climate risk and how it actually impacts every aspect of operation, from the supply chain to just how different products that you provide to a whole slew of things. And what would it look like for us also to have kind of a gender equity lens similar to that, so that everything that we do really does relate to is either impacted by or impacts climate change. And it's the same with gender equity. And so how can we work to better incorporate that, as we're also working to, of course, think about diversity and equity and inclusion as well. We have a great opportunity, I think, to really start to address all these things in a holistic way. And so we need to be encouraging policymakers to be doing a much better job of that too.
So let's change our splashes. Let's get that letter, and hopefully the act will go to vote, and hopefully our conversation today and the conversations we'll be having in the future will help to illuminate this issue. I want to thank you so much. It's been such a great discussion, and I'm honored to be sitting here with you all. And I know I speak for the people in attendance as well. Thank you very much for your time.